And yes, thank you very much for being adaptable and coming to this session. This is the first of two panels that has been planned for this week, and we encourage you to come to the second one, which will be on Thursday evening at the University of King's College at 7:30. There's a reception following that panel, and we strongly encourage you to come. They're complimentary panels. So I'm Bertrand MacDonald. I'm a faculty member in the School of Information Management at Dalhousie. I'm also the research lead for the Interdisciplinary Environmental Information Use and Influence Research Program, or EIUI, which I'll use that acronym now. And although we initiated this idea for this panel, we were very quickly joined by a number of co-sponsors who saw the significance of the topic that they're going to engage with here this afternoon. And we were very delighted that they were able to join us. So in particular, I want to thank the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance for hosting this particular session. And I want to thank Kevin Quigley, who just spoke, and his team for hosting the event, but also very quickly scrambling here today to find another venue and to invite you to be here, and I'm glad you're here. There are a number of sponsors who I wish to acknowledge for their contributions to this event and to the other events later this week. The Office of the President at Dalhousie University, the Faculty of Management, the Faculty of Science, the School of Information Management, the School of Resource and Environmental Studies, the History of Science and Technology program, and the School of Journalism at the University of King's College, and the Nova Scotian Institute of Science have all been supportive of this event, and we're very pleased that they have done so. The event is being recorded here today. We had initially planned to live stream, but given the last minute adjustments, we're unable to do that. But this recording will be available on the website of the MacEachen Institute. And for the event on Thursday evening, we will be live streaming from the University of King's College. And also the video for that event will be available from the School of Information Management website. So we're very fortunate that we have four very knowledgeable individuals who are here to participate in this panel, and I want to thank them for being very adaptive as well today to the circumstances that have developed. So we're very pleased to welcome to Canada on his first visit to Canada, Daniel Cressey from London, and we're also very pleased to welcome Megan Leslie back to Halifax. We're very pleased to welcome Jeff Hutchings, who is from Halifax, to be part of this panel, and we're also very pleased to welcome Richard Isnor back to Halifax as well. So I'm now going to turn the podium to Suzette Sumai, who is going to chair the session. Suzette recently joined the Canada Department of Fisheries and Oceans in the fisheries management area. Prior to her appointment at DFO, Suzette was a student at Dalhousie University, where she completed her master's degree and her PhD, the interdisciplinary PhD, within the EIUI research program. She undertook a study that relates to the very questions that we're going to be dealing with here today, which EIUI is very interested in. So Suzette completed a study that led her to be involved with three organizations, one national, one regional, and one international. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, where she studied decision-making processes in an intense way by being embedded inside of those organizations. So, without any further ado, Suzette.
Thanks, Bertram, and I'm really happy to be chairing this session today. The topic today is, should scientific information have preeminence in government decision-making? And we've all heard the term evidence-based decision-making or evidence-informed decision-making, and it's considered the acceptable model for decision-making at all levels of government. However, in practice, that model faces many challenges, and even though governments broadly state that they're using evidence to make their decisions, frequently researchers wonder how evidence is being used and often why evidence is being ignored in decisions. So we've got a distinguished panel of experts here who are experts in scientific research, scientific communication, and science policy, who will offer their insights into trying to answer that question. We've got a lot of information to resolve serious environmental and societal problems, and yet solutions still seem to be elusive. Why is that? We've got Daniel Cressey on my left. Daniel is the editor at Research Professional, who are the publishers of Research Fortnight and Research Europe. He's based in London. He oversees news features and comments from a global team. And before joining Research Professional in November 2017, Daniel spent 10 years at the journal Nature as an editor. Then next to Daniel, we've got Richard Isnor. And Richard is the Associate Vice President, Research and Graduate Studies, and Interim Director of the Mulroney Institute of Government at St. Francis Xavier University. Prior to joining the university in 2015, Richard held science, policy, and research administrative positions within a variety of research and funding and government agencies, such as the IDRC, the International Development Research Centre, the National Research Council, Environment Canada, the Privy Council Office, and the Nunavut Research Institute. Next to Richard, we've got Megan Leslie. And Megan is currently the president of the World Wildlife Fund Canada. She was appointed that position in December 2017. And prior to that, she spent 2 years as a consultant on ocean governance and head of ocean conservation with WWF. Even before joining WWF, Megan was a member of Parliament representing Halifax in 2 terms, during which she was deputy leader of the official opposition. She was environment critic and vice chair of government committee on environment and sustainable development. And we've got Jeffery Hutchings at the far end. Jeffery is a professor of biology and Killam Memorial Chair in Fisheries and Oceans at Dalhousie University. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a foreign fellow to the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. He's also chaired many national committees, including Canada's National Science Advisory Body on Species at Risk, commonly known as COSIWIC. He's also appeared on several parliamentary committees, and he served as external advisor to the Auditor General of Canada. So I'd like to say welcome to our 4 guests today. And I want to start off the question with, actually I just want to maybe invite each of you to just speak to the topic of our panel today, starting with Daniel.
Great. In some ways it seems almost crazy to be debating this topic. Like, should scientific information, should evidence have priority in decision making? Well, anyone who would argue against that, what else would you come up with? What else could you base decisions on? Sort of random chance, hunches. Of course evidence should be preeminent, but it isn't. People think it isn't. Lots of people can point to decisions and say that isn't evidence-based. So whose fault is that? I think one of the groups we can clearly point to as villains in this piece are the politicians themselves. You have people from my country, like our former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who during the referendum campaign to leave the European Union repeatedly said that the United Kingdom sends £350 million a week to the European Union. A statement that's completely untrue, that our independent statistics authority said was completely untrue, and it made no difference. The claim continued to be made. Going back a bit further, we had a Home Secretary called Alan Johnson, who isn't related to Boris. In 2009, he sacked his independent government advisor on drug misuse, a man called David Nutt, who's a very eminent professor, and he was sacked for saying in a scientific article that recreational horse riding was more dangerous than recreational use of MDMA, which you might not like the implications of that statement, but it's completely evidence-based. I think another example of how difficult politicians find it to use good evidence is the issue of badger culling in my country, which sometimes seems really parochial to people in North America where you have actually dangerous wildlife. But we have a program where the government kills badgers, which are our largest land predator, because it thinks that they spread tuberculosis to cattle, which causes all sorts of problems for farmers and all sorts of costs. And you would hope for something like that, which is very controversial and generates a lot of media coverage, there would be good evidence. And indeed, there's a randomised trial of badger culling and whether it works. A really big study done several years ago by some really, really eminent scientists, and that concluded that culling badgers can make no meaningful difference to tuberculosis in cattle. And it's a pretty straightforward study. They randomised it, they did the work, it didn't work, and yet we still cull badgers. And I don't want to oversimplify it. There are people on both sides of that debate. There are some really eminent scientists, including people who work for the Department of Agriculture, who think that culling does make a difference. But the kind of gold standard work to summarise the evidence in this area is a really interesting project by some people at the University of Oxford called their Restatements Group, who have this amazing scheme where when they have a complicated environmental topic that people disagree on, they try and get everyone in the same room for a day and they thrash out exactly what we know, what we can say, what level of confidence we can attribute to all of the statements we make, and they write that up in a paper and they present it, and they've done this on badger culling, and they've done it on neonicotinoids and bees. And you can go away and read those statements if you want to, but basically they said it's not really clear whether culling badgers can help control tipping and cattle. So you have a situation where the government is saying this is a totally evidence-based policy, we're going to keep doing it, and the evidence clearly isn't clear. So politicians, for my take, are definitely one of the villains. I think journalists, people such as myself, also have a role to play in this, and a role that we quite often play quite badly. And one of the reasons for this is journalists are obsessed by stories. That's how we talk about what we do. We say, this is a really good story, I've got a really good story to tell. And stories need people, they need narratives. And they don't like statistics. I mean, Stalin is supposed to have said, right, that one death is a tragedy and 1 million deaths is a statistic. And if you're a journalist, you know that tragedies sell newspapers and statistics really don't. So we focus on the new, the individual, what's happening to them, and we don't focus often enough on the bigger picture, on actually trying to say what all of the evidence says, because it's hard to do that, it's hard to sell that. And this is really clear if you ever look at health journalism. So again, in the UK, we have a wonderful body called NICE, which is part of our public health service, and when a new drug appears on the market, NICE does a rigorous evidence-based analysis of what the benefits of that drug are, how much it costs, and whether the health service can afford it. But what happens normally when one of those NICE judgments comes out is that's written up as some poor tragic individual who has a relative or a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife, who is now being denied a drug by this bureaucratic process, because that's a compelling story. And saying a rigorous bureaucratic evidence-based process says this drug is simply too expensive, that doesn't sell newspapers. So I think journalists also have to take a hard look at ourselves and how we tell stories and how we can do that in a way that doesn't distort the picture of the evidence. And finally, I think that all of you who work in academia actually can be portrayed in some way as the villains of this piece, because you're generally terrible at giving evidence to policymakers in a way that's useful to them. And you don't have to believe me on this. There's a really good study that I would urge all of you to read by our Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology that came out last year. This is an independent body that sits within the United Kingdom Parliament. And they went and spoke to politicians staff, and to other people involved in the policy-making process. And they said, how do you use evidence? What evidence do you use? And what evidence is useful to you? And pretty much everyone they spoke to said, we love evidence. Now, some people said they loved evidence for the wrong reasons, because they thought it was a really good stick to beat their political opponents. But everyone agreed that evidence was really good and you needed it. But they also said that academic evidence was useless to them in many cases. And the report itself wrote this up as academic evidence is not cutting through, it's not making it into parliamentary decision making. And that's because it arrives late, if it arrives at all, it comes laden with technical jargon, it's massively long, it's hard to parse. And what that means in a kind of narrative sense is if you're a politician and you announce you're working in a new area, probably within the next week, the business lobby will turn up to talk to you, and they have slick suits and big expense accounts, and they will tell you exactly how your policy should align with their interests. And if you don't do that, jobs will be at risk. And then maybe a week after that, the NGOs will turn up, and they'll be a bit scruffier, but they'll be very earnest. They'll have lots of grey literature to give you, and lots of think tank reports about how your policy needs to align with their interests, or people's lives will be affected. And then, maybe a month after that, you'll get an email from someone who says, I'm the most eminent professor in the UK, and I've been working in this area for 50 years, and attached are 6 of my latest research papers for you to read at your leisure. And it's clear, if you're a busy politician, which of those approaches is going to influence you more. So, I guess to cycle back to where I started, lots of people think that policy isn't evidence-based, And there are lots of different reasons for that, but I think it's easy to point the finger at other people, and we should all take a long, hard look at ourselves, because we all have a role to play in this, all of the different roles represented here on this panel, and we could all probably be doing our jobs a bit better.
Before we go on to Richard, I just want to say that we leave the questions after each panelist has had a time to speak. We'll have questions from 5 students that have been prepared ahead, and then we'll invite the audience to ask questions to the panelists. Richard?
Okay, thank you. Well, fantastic opening, Daniel. I'll try to pick up on a couple of the points you've made. I was going to say it's wonderful to be back here at Dal campus, but here we are at the Weston. But it's great to be here with Dalhousie colleagues and friends of Dalhousie. I took this class. I think this is an Introduction to Public Policy course. That's the core of this. I took this class in 1991. I'm a grad of the Dal Masters of Environmental Studies program. I graduated in '92. And that was actually the time in my career when I got interested in science policy. I had done an undergraduate degree in science, wondering what to do with myself, and I saw an advertisement for a newly created scholarship that had been created by the Government of Canada, jointly administered by NSERC and SSHRC, which doesn't really happen that often. And it was for a master's scholarship in science policy studies. It didn't last very long. I think they only kept the scholarship around for about 6 years, and they didn't give many of them out. They should have given more of them out, and they should have kept it. It was an excellent way to get students interested in this area. So I came to Dal, and I took environmental studies because when I looked around the country, there wasn't any program to take in science policy studies in Canada at that time. There are programs now, there are courses now, and the fact that a seminar like this is being held as part of an introductory public policy course at the graduate level, I think is a fantastic thing. So that really got my interest going in this area. I went on and did a doctorate in science and technology policy studies in the UK. There was a dedicated research unit at the University of Sussex and one at the University of Manchester in this area. Sussex's program was slightly better, so I went there. And it was the height of the BSE crisis, if people know what that is, the mad cow crisis in the UK. So it was an interesting time to be studying science policy in the UK as this crisis was unfolding. When I came back to Canada after my graduate studies, I started a career in government and worked in a number of different departments and agencies, both at kind of the provincial territorial level, but also mainly at the federal government level. And so the first thing I would say is one of the reasons we're talking about this is because it's a complex area, I think, and there's a number of and it's become more complex over time, but it's not new. At the time I was a graduate student, there were many issues that were at play in the science policy interface. And there have been many before that. And there have been successes and failures in dealing with those different kinds of issues. It's important, I think, for students especially to understand there are 2 faces to the science policy coin. So one is policy for science, and that's what governments are doing to try to advance science, support science in society. And then there's the other side, which is really what we're primarily talking about today, and that is science for policy. So how does science inform policy and decision making? These are not mutually exclusive sides of the coin. They are interrelated, but you can parse them and talk about them in turn. And of course, following on from Daniel, I mean, we're debating this issue: should science have preeminence in policy making? I agree with him. I don't know how you can really argue against that.
Wait for it.
But okay, but I think at the same time, and I think the background readings touch on this significantly, science has to be seen in the context of policy making, and that there are many other factors at work. And Daniel touched on some of the examples that politicians, at least, see those different factors at work when they come into their office and faced with different kinds of evidence and different kinds of arguments. I'll touch on a couple of things just to try to stay slightly different from what Daniel talked about. First of all, I think there's, when it comes to trying to understand the science policy interface, there's a number of terminology challenges that can arise. What is research? What is research and development? What is science? What is science and technology? What is knowledge? Who generates knowledge? What kinds of knowledge have legitimacy and trust in public policy making? These are all relevant questions. And today, of course, it gets confused by this new word that's come into play so often, which is innovation. And all governments want to talk about innovation. And they don't really know, politicians especially don't really know, what innovation means. They talk about innovation as if it's research. And research is not innovation. So we have challenges in terminology, and just trying to tease out what these different things mean, I think is kind of a step one in terms of starting to understand this area. And a second issue really goes to the roles, the different roles that governments play in science policy. And going back to the two-sided coin issue, many governments are trying to pursue policies to advance different kinds of science for all kinds of public good and policy objectives, to address environmental management issues, such as fisheries management, health issues, but also trying to advance science in support of economic development and the jobs agenda and the skills agenda and all of that kind of thing. So, so the other question is, so what are the different kinds of approaches and policy instruments and tools that governments use for that? And a key question that you find yourself discussing in this area is, so how much science should government conduct? What kinds of mechanisms should government have to absorb and deal with science and scientific information and different forms of evidence? And, or should governments pursue policies of basically buying research and scientific information? Should it use more in the terminology, use more extramural forms? And you heard Daniel talk about, the challenges for government absorbing academic information. Well, one of the policy trends in Canada has been a discernible shift in focusing more on the generation of what we call extramural research information. So research is conducted primarily now in academia, in Canada at least, and the levels of capacity within government to generate its own research information have significantly declined in the last 40 years. It used to be the other way around. The federal government, at least in Canada, was the preeminent conductor of science and research in Canada. That has significantly changed in the last 40 years, and it has had implications for the management of the science policy interface. And I guess the last thing I would say is that the challenges around science and its treatment in policy processes doesn't really come down to partisan or party line issues. I think there are examples of all parties that have, when they've been in power at least, that have ignored science and ignored evidence. And there are examples of different parties that have embraced science and evidence and put it into practice in managing different policy issues. So I think you really have to take a case-by-case approach. One thing I will say that over the last 40 years, there's been a wonderful evolution in the literature on this topic. That didn't exist probably 40 years ago. It's really grown along with the policy studies literature, which is great. It's kind of a very specialized offshoot of the policy studies literature. But we have new mechanisms in Canada, like the Canadian Council of Academies that plays a key role, and some of the kinds of things similar to what Daniel was talking about in the UK. We have Canadian versions of those now. But again, some of those are not necessarily new. They're evolutions of different things that existed prior. How many people here would remember that we had a thing called the Science Council of Canada once upon a time, which did do work at the science policy interface and was phased out in the Mulrooney years in favor of other advisory mechanisms, but now we have things like the Canadian Council of Academies of Science. So I'll stop there, just as kind of a set of issues for consideration, and let Megan go next so we can hear why science shouldn't get preeminence.
Thanks. This is, I know we didn't plan the order, but this is good. I feel like I'm below sea level here, so I'm trying to project.
Sports cars.
I know these are really comfy, but we're, and thanks for showing up. I really thought we were going to be, talking to 3 or 4 people, so thanks for showing up and being so flexible. Okay, so the title of the panel is Should Scientific Evidence Have Preeminence in Policymaking? And no, I don't think so. Perhaps it's because I used to be one of those villains. I can't believe I'm sitting here. I thought my political days were over, and I am going to spend this entire panel defending politicians. So I don't think that science should take preeminence. Preeminence meaning, the most significant or the thing that you should have at the top of your list for considering. And that's because I think that scientific evidence is one kind of evidence. And there are lots of other kinds of evidence. And if you think about how scientific evidence is developed, it's developed in a controlled environment. Sometimes in a lab, sometimes out in the field, but you want to control everything around it. Policy making is messy. It is messy, messy business. People are involved. People with all of their biases, with all of their predispositions, with their passions, with their prejudging. People are involved, economies are involved, communities are involved, countries are involved. It is messy business. And I do think that science is just one factor when you're looking at policy development. Imagine you are a member of parliament and you have a fishery off your coast. And it doesn't even matter what fish. That fish, some scientists come to you, some fisheries scientists, and they tell you the stock of that fish is in decline and we're worried about where it's going. So you think, well, if the stock is in decline, then let's close the fishery, right? That's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. But then fishermen, who are your constituents, come to you and they say, hey, wait a minute, if you close this fishery, we're going to be out of jobs. And here's historical evidence to show that anytime there's been a closure of the fishery, more fishermen have ended up relying on assistance like employment insurance. So there's the historical evidence that we're showing you. But then the premier comes to you and she says, we can dream, she says, wait a minute, we have a trade deal with this European country and they're relying on a quota of fish from us. And if they don't get that quota of fish, let me show you the trade deal. Here's evidence they're going to withdraw the cheap generic drugs that they give to our province. And here's some more evidence to show you that if we don't have access to those cheap generic drugs, low-income Nova Scotians are going to have to go without their medications. And then some other constituents come to you, constituents who've been here the longest, Mi'kmaq constituents, and they say, hey, here is the Supreme Court of Canada decision, Marshall. This is evidence that we actually have a right to support to a livelihood here through the fishery. And then you have some bright young students from the MacEachen Institute, and they've been reading about common pool resource, and they've been reading Eleanor Ostrom. And they say, well, even if you close the fishery, Eleanor Ostrom says there's no evidence that people are going to stop fishing. There's no evidence people will stop fishing, and there's no evidence to show that the government would be able to enforce any of this fishery closure anyway. So what do? Policymaking is a really messy subject, and there are all these different competing factors. And I think we have to understand that it's not a controlled environment like science. And the way that we can see through this, in my opinion, is by marrying all those factors together. Thinking about how do we take the best science, how do we take the realities of lived experience of the people living in these communities, how do we take the economy, how do we work all these pieces together to come up with the best policy answer in this moment. I'm going to complicate it a little further though and talk about some of the the things that we don't always think about when we're looking at policy, when we're studying public policy, and that's the reality of our political process. It's uncomfortable, but people run for parties. Parties of different ideologies. Maybe a person ran for that party because they believe that government needs to get out of people's lives, and we could all be more successful if government would just take a back seat and let us flourish. Or maybe a person ran for a party because they believe that government is there to serve people and help us and support us to live our best lives. So maybe that decision that's being made is linked to a party's ideology. Or a really uncomfortable truth about policy making, we have elections every 4 years. Are you going to make a decision that is scientifically correct, that would be the best outcome for the environment, but that none of your constituents support? Are you going to be that brave? Or are you going to vote with what the majority of your constituents say. Is that why you got elected? To just vote with the majority? Do you think that maybe you have the persuasive skills to say, you know what, I'm going to do what I think is right, and then I got 3 years to convince everybody? Do you have those kind of persuasive skills? So there's a lot at play for decision makers. And I think about, so I'm at WWF now, World Wildlife Fund, and I think about a program that we have up in the Arctic around polar bears. So if you look worldwide, evidence shows you that when there's carnivores and people, the carnivores don't usually do very well in the end. Tiger numbers are plummeting, wolf populations are plummeting, and we have a situation in the Arctic where polar bear populations are relatively stable. We can see maybe where it could go if we look at other carnivores, but they're relatively stable. There isn't a pressing need for WWF to do polar bear conservation the way that we're trying to double tiger populations in Nepal, for example. But there's this town on the west coast of Hudson Bay called Arviat, and Arviat is in a polar bear migration route. So when the polar bears are heading to Hudson Bay in the Arctic in the fall looking for sea ice so they can go out and hunt, they pass through this town. There's 1,200 people in this town. It's a hamlet, really, and hundreds of polar bears can come through this town during the fall. That puts people's safety directly at risk. It's not safe to be out in the streets. They very famously had to move their trick-or-treating with all the kids into a community center because you can't send kids out. God.
Maybe for the tree.
Yeah, you can't, and they're in their snowsuits and they can't run fast. It's not going to end well. So one thing that we did at WWF was we went to the community and worked with them, and we created a polar bear monitoring program where we actually have monitors that we pay a salary, and they are on call 24/7 during the polar bear migration, and they do everything that they can to ensure that they minimize polar bear human conflict. And they have, for 10 years, were successful in not having either a polar bear or a human death. They lure the polar bears away from town, they try to scare the polar bears away from town, any means necessary to get them to avoid town and prevent that conflict. And when I think about why we do that program, it isn't so much, yes, we don't want people shooting polar bears, but we do support people's ability to harvest polar bears in a traditional harvest. So it's not about that one polar bear that doesn't get killed. It's about making sure that a community has a basic need met, the need of safety. And if they have that basic need met, then we can work with them on conservation issues more broadly. It is quite amazing that our staff can be at community meetings in this town where people talk about increasing the numbers for the harvest, but also how do we protect the habitat for denning mothers so that these cubs can be reared to adulthood. It's an interesting tension, but it doesn't have to be a conflict in having those two things in your brain at the same time. So if you think about the communities, you think about science, you think about the economies, I think that you can come up with good, robust policy where science is a major contributing factor. I'll end with the piece that I want to share about how do we ensure that science is a major contributing factor, because you heard, I mean, there's, I think we're maybe even have a question about post-truth and politicians saying, well, there are these scientists who say that climate change is not real, it's not man-made. So how do we ensure that science is preeminent in decision-making, whether it's with elected officials making those decisions or civil servants who also have a huge role to play in policy development? When I was a member of Parliament, the Canadian Medical Association had this program called MDs for MPs, so medical doctors for members of Parliament. And they paired up medical doctors in each riding with an MP. So I had this local MD who'd take me out for coffee every few months and sit down with me and talk about what was going on in the world of healthcare and what was going on in medicine that I should know about. Because I was debating a lot of things in Parliament, like Canada-Colombia Free Trade Act, and whether or not we were going to, how we were going to use assisted human reproduction. I don't know anything about assisted human reproduction. So this MD would sit down and we just talk about issues, and I could ask him my silliest questions and just get informed. And it got to a point where I'd be sitting in committee and there could be moments in committee where I didn't understand what was going on with the witnesses. And I actually could text him and say, hey, does this sound right? And if he was able, I mean, this guy wasn't on call for me, goodness. But he'd send back and say, actually, no, try it this way. And it was this amazing relationship that helped me do my job better and ensure that I had science at the forefront of my thinking around policy issues. And so to your point about journalists not covering science either and politicians not understanding science, befriend a city councillor, befriend a journalist, befriend a minister, my goodness, and just take them out for coffee. Get to know them. It's not about an issue that you want this journalist to cover or you want this MP to vote on, but just be available to them and share your knowledge so that you can build this trusting relationship. It can go so far to ensure that journalistic coverage of science is accurate and that policy making is actually based in science. Thanks.
Right, well, I guess that's to me. I'm a scientist, I'm a fish biologist. Maybe we should have fish biologists for MPs.
Yes!
Each riding in the country, we could take someone out fishing or for something different. A couple of interesting things. I agree with Megan that science should not be the sole reason for policy decision making. That's not the role of scientists. That's, as Megan articulated, there are many things that politicians need to think about and weigh in balance, and science absolutely should be one of those things. And if there's a critical thing, it's that the science information is available and the public is fully informed as to the scientific basis or lack thereof associated with particular policy decisions. What the decision makers do with that is something we can judge at election time or on other occasions. But I'm not uncomfortable with having decision makers make decisions. That accounts for the best available information. One small example, I chaired COSIWIC for 4 years, the National Science Advisory Body on Species at Risk in Canada. And before the Species at Risk Act was passed in Parliament in December 2002, there were many scientists, I think there was a 2,000 scientists signed a letter saying COSIWIC should be the body that decides whether species are listed in Canada, whether something's endangered or threatened. It should be up to the scientists, and that's where it should stop. As having chaired the committee for 4 years, I can tell you absolutely not. Because COSIWIC makes its decisions based on the best available information independently or irrespective of the consequences of those decisions. It's an advisory body to the Minister of the Environment, and if it was perceived to have vested interests, it would crumble. It would no longer serve its purpose. And indeed, the pressures on COSIWIC would be immense if the final decision were left with unelected scientists. No, it should be with elected officials. Polar bears are interesting insofar as I chaired COSIWIC when polar bears were listed as a species of special concern, and many NGOs and many people hated that decision. But it was based on science. Megan is right, polar bears are roughly stable. But at the time, there was this headline, which has received something like 1 million Google hits, polar bears will be extinct or will be gone by 2050. This was constantly the headline that was seen everywhere. Polar bears will be gone. Like 2/3 will be gone by 2050. That sounds dramatic. If you dig down a little bit, you find that the basis for that comes from one report by the US Geological Survey, and it's based on what's called a Bayesian network analysis or an expert opinion analysis from one individual. One person. That's where that came from. So if you dig down, you might like what 2/3 of the polar bears by 2050 will be gone. You might like the sentiment of that. You might think, well, that, I can fight the politicians on climate change with that kind of information. But if you dig down to where the science came from, you'll find that it's actually not well founded at all. In terms of the degree to which, so science, availability of science information is fundamentally important. The degree to which it's going to which decisions are going to depend on science will depend on the perceived risks of not doing so. If it's a health thing, if it's a drug or something, or it's a mechanical thing and government needs to make policies about the safety of something, then science suddenly becomes rather important. But if it's about a species at risk, or if it's about fisheries sustainability, sometimes those things don't matter quite so much for some of the reasons that Megan indicated. I think in terms of fisheries, it's kind of an interesting example because of all the things in the world, fisheries from a global perspective is still the only wild organisms that we regularly hunt or harvest. And 1 in 6 people depend on fish protein in the world. Fisheries actually matter. Although in Canada, other than the coasts, fisheries don't matter very much. So I think one of the problems, one of the reasons why science doesn't manifest itself or isn't well reflected in many fisheries management decisions is that there are few, if any, political costs associated with not accounting for science, because most of the country isn't very engaged in what happens in oceans. And from the Supreme Court of Canada's perspective, in 1997, it made it fairly plain, fairly clear that the fisheries are a public resource in Canada, and that it's the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans' responsibility to manage those resources on behalf of all Canadians. Not particular industries, but all Canadians. And this is what led to the development of the precautionary approach for fisheries sustainability and fisheries management and resource management. And as a result of various UN conventions and international conventions, Canada eventually developed what's called the Sustainable Fisheries Framework, which is a set of policies which is meant to govern how Canada achieves fisheries sustainability. And they were developed in 2009. And there's 3 key elements to that. For a given fish stock, you determine what's called a limit reference point, below which you don't want the population to fall. A target reference point, which is what you want the population to grow to, and something called a harvest control rule, which determines how hard you fish the stock depending how close it is to the limit reference point or how close it is to the target. Well, Canada's policy, if you read it, says that the limit reference point is determined by science. The target reference point is determined by management, considering the interests of the fishing industry and other interests with advice from science. The harvest control rule is in the same boat. It's decided by fisheries managers in consultation with stakeholders, but science is sort of an add-on. So the difficulty there is it's often difficult to find what scientists has actually said about a target reference point. The Auditor General of Canada and others have indicated that we don't know what the state of some of our fisheries are in because we haven't identified the targets. Why not? Scientists can do this. Scientists have known for 15 years how to apply scientifically robust and widely used means of estimating targets for sustainability. The reason we haven't is because of this need to consult industry. So scientists might typically come up with a target up here based on widely recognized methods, but the industry says, no, that's too high, we want it lower. And the end result is a stalemate. And we're not progressing. Northern cod closed in 1992, 30 to 40,000 people put out of work, 5 to 6 billion Canadian dollars have been spent on social assistance as a result of that. 10% of the population of Newfoundland left in 10 years. Huge socioeconomic and biological consequences. That was 1992. It's 2018, and we still don't have a target for recovery of northern cod. But I will say I'd like to finish on sort of a positive side of things, and that is ways in which, or unanticipated ways in which science can influence policy. And through my own personal experience, that has come in different ways. Since 2009, I've been advising Loblaw, the largest food retailer in Canada, on their sustainable seafood policies. And that has been a very interesting experience insofar as one can take one's knowledge of fisheries sustainability policy and fish biology and fishery science and directly influence the purchasing and sourcing decisions that this large food retailer makes. That in itself has some indirect influence on government because sometimes Loblaw is not going to purchase things if there's no targets, if there are no harvest control rules. Another way is through COSIWIC. COSIWIC, as this independent national science advisory body, is in this unique position, as I discovered as chair, to mediate between government departments that don't typically talk to one another. Fisheries Department, Environment Department, Parks Canada used to be a separate entity. These silos didn't talk to one another at all, but Cosima could convene, and we did convene meetings where these bodies came together along with members of the Department of Justice to make sure everything was smooth, and developed policies as part of Cosima that ended up being part of what the different government departments did. And with respect to SARA, a key element, a key definition is wildlife species. SARA is there to protect wildlife species, to recover wildlife species. What's a wildlife species? It's not well defined in the Act. So Cosima was able to come up with a definition based on fundamental basic principles of population biology, genetics, and evolutionary significance that is now de facto used as the definition of wildlife species in Canada. And the last way is through expert panels. You talked about the Canadian Council of Academies. As of a week ago, I'm now on their Science Advisory Committee, so see what happens with that. But I have been on a couple of Royal Society of Canada expert panels, and one in 2012 dealt with Canadian fisheries sustainability and marine biodiversity. And the 7 recommendations that we made in that report were picked up on by several NGOs and several academics. And I like to think that that's been part of the movement that's taken place in the initiative, which has resulted in a change in wording to the Fisheries Act. So the Fisheries Act is in the process of being revised right now. In the past, this is an act from 1868. There's nothing in it about recovery or rebuilding, but there might be now. So there's different ways in which individuals and groups can have an influence, I think, on policy and the way that statutes are dealt with, and so I think that there are some positive elements, along with some of the negative ones as well.
Thanks. It's so great to hear tangible ways in which we can use information in decision making. And I have one question, which I'll pose to the panel, and then we'll open up we have 4 students waiting with questions, and then we'll have the audience ask questions. So Megan, you put me on the spot there about post-truth. So I do have a question about, it's common to hear now that we're living in a post-truth universe. Society is bombarded with fake news. And how do you convince the public when they become skeptics of what they read in the media? How do we improve trust? What's the role of science in addressing fake news? And I know I'm asking several questions. This is not just one question, but it's under the theme of post-truth. Do you see this as a role of the Chief Science Advisor? One of the readings for this class was by Sir Peter Gluckman, who's a Chief Science Advisor in New Zealand, who's been talking a great deal about the importance of truth and the complexities of the decision-making process and building those trust relationships as being one of the ways of sort of addressing fake news. What are your perspectives on that? From an NGO perspective, Megan, you want to start?
I have very little. I don't know what to do with this, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say.
So the media experts
to
did
the media
first.
expert. But I will. The only thing I'll say is all of my examples about talk to your MP and what about the economy and what about communities and all that scenario that I sort of laid out only works if we have trust in our institutions, if we have trust in Parliament, if we have trust in the Supreme Court of Canada, if we have trust in our Constitution, and I do see that trust being eroded right now. I'm not sure what to do about it, but even the fact that we're seeing, we just saw a notwithstanding clause used in Ontario and threats of it being used in other provinces to circumvent the Constitution. Not circumvent, that's unfair, because I take that back. But this only works if we have trust in these institutions, and it is eroding.
I think when we discuss fake news, it's quite important to differentiate the different ways that people use it. And there is some genuine, completely fake news out there, which is people just make up stories, put them on the internet just for clicks and to get money. I think the more pervasive and perhaps the more damaging use of it is the way that people label stories they don't like as fake news, and we see that all the time, especially the country on your southern border. I'm not sure there's an immediate solution to this, but it is about doing your jobs properly in the media and in science and being honest about where the balance of opinion lies. And when you don't know everything, admitting that and not feigning certainty that isn't there. And because if you don't do that, you do lose trust. And there will always be an individual expert that you can point to that agrees with your position. But if you're just pointing at one expert and ignoring the 100 others who say something different, then that's when we get into real problems and people can start saying, oh, that's just fake news because I've heard from someone else that means something different.
So I think I'll make two quick points. So I think this is another example, in fact, of how advances in science and technology have a dark side, right? And so what we're talking about here is, in a way, the dark side of information technology, right? It's been the evolution and pervasiveness of communication technologies in some ways that have led to what we're talking about right now. And so it's another example of nefarious effects of things, the same kinds of things that were considered about biotechnology and nanotechnology and that kind of thing are coming out with information technology, which has a lot of great benefits as well. I mean, you look at the benefits that information technology have had in developing countries in terms of advancing development objectives. They're incredible, but there's this dark side as well. But the other thing, I have to say this, as working at a university, there's a critical role for our educational institutions, right? I mean, it's perhaps an overwrought word in academia, this idea that we foster critical thinking, but absolutely we need to foster critical thinking. We have to teach critical thinking skills and the ability to not just accept what you read on Wikipedia as being the absolute truth. And so teaching students as they come through their education process about this, I think, is critical. And so, back to students of public policy, how many students of public policy are coming from scientific backgrounds or integrating information on what science and knowledge is and how to deal with that in the kinds of things that they're learning about, as opposed to just kind of like the traditional route of I studied political science and now I'm doing public administration, and you have to integrate some of this aspect into your education, and so part of the onus is on us at universities for doing this.
Yeah, thinking of the idea of a chief science advisor, I've written about this, and as have others, and as many of you will know, we had that position until 2004, and then the position was removed from government and then reinstated last year. And Mona Niemer is the Chief Science Advisor to the Government of Canada. This kind of position has been around in the UK since the mid-60s, and in the UK they have a Chief Government Science Advisor and a Chief Science Advisor within each of the ministries, which is really telling. And an important element to that is it creates an environment, an acceptance that science matters, and that ministers and people within departments and at the head of government can gain access to a broad expertise within the ministries or within the UK or further afield if necessary. So I think that lays the groundwork for an environment that's very important, but it must be well funded. And the Chief Science Advisor must be able to report to Cabinet and to the head of government, not to a minister. What we had in the past was reporting to a minister. Reporting to ministers
and then a deputy minister.
To a deputy minister, which is suboptimal, useless almost. So you need to have the ear of Cabinet, and Cabinet needs to be able to interact with the Chief Science Advisor. And the only other thing I'll say with respect to this is the other element from this is we keep sort of talking about this as if it's the information coming from the scientific community and others with science information to government, but maybe there's a role of government to come back to the community and say, here's a policy that we're developing, and here's the outcome, the policy outcome that we'd like to achieve, and we're thinking of 2 or 3 ways of getting at that. Can you advise us from a science perspective, given your area of expertise, on the likelihood of achieving this policy outcome if we do option A, B, or C? I would love to see that translated into a semi-formal or formal process that in large part is absent today.
So I think we could start with the questions from the students. So we'll just ask each student to identify themselves, and the question is directed to a specific panelist.
Hi, my name is Jean-Luc Lemieux. I have a question for Meg and Leslie, but it might be politically minded, so if you'd wish to just refrain from making a political statement, that's
Exciting.
That's totally fine. I have another question that I would be also willing to put forward. It's up to you. Go for it.
Let me hear it.
All right. So we were just talking about we talked earlier about how politicians and ministers can use science to advocate for particular value-laden political objectives. In the Ottawa Citizen in May 2016, Trevor Swerdfather, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Science, is reported to say, there has been a move away, and he's referring to the Liberal government, from mandated research where scientists were told what to study according to the government's priorities. And that, many argued, held them, the Conservatives, back from pursuing real discovery. So just like you were saying, should science be directed at issues that are currently in debate in the political sphere, or should it be objective? And my question, to put it more directly, is should studies be encouraged to answer specific policy questions to promote the use of science, or does this defeat the idea of value-neutral science?
Well, you know what? I think that question is for people who aren't me, because I don't know what the role, what you were talking about. I don't know the role of government in science. I don't know if government should be relying on having its own scientific expertise and having its own, should they be pursuing knowledge for the sake of knowledge, or should universities be doing that? And then the government can actually use those discoveries. I mean, how does it work?
So I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Liz. So this comes back to a couple of points I was trying to make in the introduction. So you're coming back to how does government organize and support its scientific enterprise and effort in support of different policy objectives. And so one of that is through its own internal science capacity. And even within that, it subdivides into different things. And Jeffrey would tell you this because he was part of that enterprise at one point himself. Right? There's the research arm. So there's parts of government that conduct research studies just in this a very similar way to what you see in universities. But then there are a whole host of other science-based activities, and in the terminology these are called related science activities. They're defined as such by the OECD. There are measures, you measure these with statistics, through Statistics Canada and that kind of thing. And these are a number of different kinds of occupations. There are people that carry out science assessments. There are people that do weather forecasting. There are people that work more at the science policy interface, developing guidelines. And these are fed through the policy-making apparatus up to ministers and that kind of thing. And so there are certain advantages of having this capacity inside of government departments. It's directly connected, and often they're working in the same building, right? Whereas if you are engaging extramural research in the science policy enterprise or interface, you have to use different mechanisms to get the connections done. And we heard about some of those. Having day-long workshops where everybody's in the room. You have to create the spaces. You have to do that within government as well. But so it is messy.
Yeah.
It's messy. It's not easy to do. And having science advisory processes are absolutely part of the process inside of government, and appropriately supported external processes too, like the Canadian Council of Canadian Academies. Sorry, I'm jumbling on that one. Which in fact actually responds to requests of government. Mm-hmm. Government departments make requests for certain kinds of knowledge assessments on topical issues. and engages the scientific community in helping to produce those. And there have been, to come back to a point that Jeffrey was making about that demand pull from a policy point of view for science, there have been mechanisms. It's been argued in the literature, for example, one of Canada's best examples is the Acid Rain Accord. And if you read Bruce Dern's account of what happened during the Acid Rain Treaty with the United States, Canada outscienced the United States. We had to. It was the only way we would get a treaty with the US on acid rain, was by developing our own scientific information that we could take to the Americans. There have been other examples too. When I worked at Environment Canada, we created a program. It was a small funding program, but it was all about identifying the policy issues that science needed to inform, and then having a competitive process to engage government and university scientists in trying to develop studies that would address those directly connected to the policymaking apparatus. So there have been examples. There are great case studies to study.
And if I can make that even messier, I'm sure if you did a search, you would find my name speaking out against that decision at the time, in the role I was in at that time. However, it's a legitimate policy decision for a government to make. Do we do our own science, or do we not? Do we do science for the sake of it, or do we try and discover a particular thing? That is a legitimate policy decision that governments can and did and continue to take.
Thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to say also with the microbeads, you must have used science, and I remember you got rid of flavored cigarettes in the prime time. That was encouraging. So there must have been science behind that.
There was.
Hello, my name is Léa Collin. I'm a French exchange student. And my question is mainly directed to Jeffery Hutchings, because I came up with this question by reading your article. But it may, well, if someone else feels that it is more appropriate for him to answer the question, like, it's okay. It's a question about the democratic legitimacy of the scientist. Well, it's deliberately a little bit exaggerated and caricatural, just to be sure that you make point. But the scientists who can influence public decision making, they are not elected by the citizens. So how legitimate are they to influence the public decision if they represent like a minority and not the public opinion in a whole? Isn't it in a way dangerous for democracy and a kind of maybe betrayal and treason of the voters?
So the degree to which scientists have a legitimate role, or the advocacy versus advisory capacity, yeah, I think this is an extremely difficult topic, but an extremely important topic. When scientists are asked to appear before parliamentary committees, or when individual scientists are asked to provide scientific advice, or to speak to the media on a particular topic, I think it's very important that scientists use objectivity as the goal to attain and not advocacy, unless you wish to identify yourself as an advocate for a particular thing. So a good example in Canada a few years ago had to do with seals eating cod. And the government of Canada was considering whether to remove 70,000 seals every year for 5 years in hopes that this would allow the cod to recover. And as a scientist, one could say, if you're asked the question, is there any evidence that seals eat cod? The answer is yes, there's very good evidence. There's very good evidence in the peer-reviewed literature, and it's even stronger today than it was then, that seal predation is an important source of mortality on cod. But the question of whether, I'm thinking of the badgers here, is that from a science perspective, you can also be asked what's the likelihood of this culling measure, of this removal measure, of us actually being able to tell 10 years from now whether a shift in the cod population could be attributed to this management action of removing seals? And the answer is there's no way you could tell. There's no way you could link the two, because the ecosystem is more than two species. But I think you're also getting at this really important element in my own mind, is that when scientists start to advocate, we're falling back on our personal value systems. And the personal value systems of a scientist have no more importance than the personal value systems of the citizenry who might be affected by decisions, or the politicians who you are advising. So if you're going to be an advocate, simply state that. Don't pretend you are being objective, for that simple reason that the way that we think doesn't matter more than the value systems of other people.
Do you want to go to another question?
Hello, my name is Kyle. I'm also an MPA student, but my academic and professional background before coming here is actually wildlife conservation and management, so this whole topic is quite familiar to me. So my question is directed toward Dr. Hutchings. So say, as future analysts, how can we prepare for issues where government plans to enact policies based on the best available science, but said policy will lead to massive public outrage? So in this hypothetical scenario, let's say that Parks Canada determined that the feral horses on Sable Island are degrading that insular ecosystem to the point where it's going to collapse. So they're planning to either round them up and sell them or kill them or cull them. So how can we, as future, how can we prevent policymakers from giving into kind of these public sentiments where if we don't do something, something bad is going to happen? And then how can we better communicate the scientific rationale behind our decisions to the lay public?
So I think both of your questions, in my view, come down to properly articulating the trade-offs associated with different policy decisions, or just different decisions in general. We have we tend to focus very much on specific causes and consequences. Decision will lead to this. I don't like that outcome. And we all naturally do this because we like that sort of linear thinking. In the absence of thinking about what are the other costs and benefits that might be realized or come about such a decision. Your example reminds me a bit, and I thought you were going to say pipelines. Pretty hot topic in Canada right now. And I was listening to something on the weekend in Vancouver dealing with a court case of a vessel that released oil in English Bay. And looking at how that's progressing, this was 3 years ago. But suddenly it occurred to me, when we're thinking about oil spills off the coast of BC, objectively, I thought, how much oil is lost or spilt on the coast of BC on an annual basis? I have no idea. No one's ever said that. And once I know that, then I could possibly place the size of a potential spill from the pipeline into that context. But it's never presented that way. And we've become so polarized with certain issues, fish farming, bottom trawling, pipeline construction, that the middle ground of considering costs and benefits in a broader perspective seems to be lost.
Hello, my name is Laura Graham, and I am also a first-year MPA student. My question is for Dr. Isnor. As a Mount Allison alumnus and now working at St. FX, you are a champion for small liberal arts-focused universities. In an effort to marry all of these complicated public policy factors, one could argue there's a need for increased science literacy in the general adult population, which includes key government decision makers. You touched on this briefly, but could you elaborate on how academic institutions should truly and tangibly foster science literacy for students who are traditionally arts-focused and have grown up to be afraid of math and science? Are minimum mandatory science courses enough? Thank you.
Hi, Laura. Nice to see you. Laura's a Sandbeck's grad, by the way. So I'll try to answer that. Well, first of all, let me just say, about a year ago at a meeting of our Senate, I advocated for some mandatory science requirements in our Bachelor of Arts program. There are mandatory humanities and arts components of our Bachelor of Science program at St. FX, so I felt, the shoe. But I would say the other innovation that we've had recently, speaking to specifically St. FX, is we've created a new degree in the last 2 years called a Bachelor of Arts and Science degree. So it's both, and it's a little bit follows some of the kind of programs you see at Dalhousie in the Faculty of Management, including the one that I took, the Master of Environmental Studies, which was about half and half, science-based and social science and humanities-based. And some areas, of course, like studying environmental studies, is truly interdisciplinary. You have to have your feet in both buckets when you're doing that. So to go back to the first part of your question about small liberal arts universities, and so I guess I'm an advocate. Certainly in my role as research administrator, or lead research administrator for St. FX, and this is partly influenced by my experience as an undergraduate student at Mount Allison, in which I got to do research every year. I didn't do it at Mount A, but I worked at what's now known as the Dal Agricultural Campus, because I'm from Truro. I worked every summer as a research assistant, as an undergraduate student, and it had a big influence on me. And the fact that I got to publish papers and give, participate in research conferences and be treated as a peer with a faculty member at an undergraduate level had a big influence on me. And so at St. FX, that's something I promote. And it's partly, it informs my advocacy, I would say, with respect to the government funding system for science in Canada. I'm involved with a number of groups, and I'm vocal and write on this, and I'm clearly an advocate for having a science funding ecosystem in Canada that is not exclusively focused on elites at big universities. I think we should consider it an ecosystem, and ecosystems diversify. So having science done in all of our universities, I mean, it is what makes universities universities, is important. And so having the ability to participate in research is something I'm an advocate about. I'm not unbiased. Let me put it that way. Anyway, so I'll kind of stop there. But I think that. But that is what will help us address this issue that we're talking about today. Because, for example, our universities are spread across the country. They're in communities. And so having students and faculty members that can participate in research, they're going to address local issues. They're going to address national issues. They're going to address international issues. And if those efforts are concentrated in too few hands, which is another area of study in science policy, by the way, is, like, how do governments divvy up the funds, and where does, who gets the funding? We look at that a lot in science policy. That, if that becomes too concentrated, I think it's to the detriment of dealing with effectively with the kinds of issues that you see all the time at the science policy interface. Hopefully that answered your question.
Sure. I'd like to address the question to Daniel Cressey, please. Thank you. Daniel, as a journalist, do you feel obligated to not only present what seems to be the mainstream science view, but also others who have different viewpoints, to give this so-called balanced perspective in reporting? How prominent is that, and is that a problem?
I think you certainly feel, or you should feel as a journalist, an obligation to present the truthful picture. But it does become a problem if there's an obsessive focus on balance, because too often what that boils down to is presenting opposing views, and opposing views are not necessarily balanced views. I mean, the classic example of this is climate change. where the BBC in the UK spent years presenting climate change as, here is the author of a new paper on climate change, and here is one of 5 climate skeptics, which we have on rotation, and they will now debate whether climate change is real. That's not balance. Balance would be having the 1,000 scientists from the IPCC and give all of them 5 minutes, and then give the other skeptic 5 minutes. So there is a problem if you just focus and say there has to be an opposing view to everything. I think the more important thing, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, is trying in some way to capture what the true state of debate in the scientific community is and convey that. And that's much harder to do and in some ways almost impossible, because you can't speak to every single scientist and find out what they think. But that's what we should be aspiring to look at that overall picture and not just saying, well, who disagrees with this, and then I'll quote them as well.
So I'm not a student, but I was one at one point, and I like what I'm hearing about the role of academic institutions in fostering critical thinking, but I'm concerned about sort of like a bubble that academic knowledge can exist in, and so paywalls for academic literature can be prohibitive, and there's a lot of successful SHIRT grants where the only knowledge mobilization component is like presenting at other academic conferences. So I'm wondering about the panel's thoughts on addressing this problem, or if you agree that it's a problem, or if open source publishing is enough.
I think it's certainly fair to say that a lot of the incentives for academics, at least in my country, aren't geared towards the kind of evidence that policymakers need. I mean, you talk to people who work in policy and they need the big evidence synthesis, the meta-analyses, that kind of stuff. Whereas what many academics are really rewarded for is getting a big paper in a big publication that has something new in it. We don't incentivize in the same way getting everyone in a room and getting them to agree what's important. And the paper that you get out, so the papers that the Oxford Restatement Group I was talking about gets out, they don't get published in Nature, they don't get published in Science, they don't get those big impact factor journals. So if we as a society decide that we want to get more evidence from academia into policy, then I think we would need to adjust what we incentivize. And in some ways this happens a bit in my country. We look at impact, which is a very broad and nebulous concept, but some of the funding in a very, and this is a huge oversimplification, but some of the funding for British universities is driven by what those academics can demonstrate of their impact. And that can be your citation count, but it can also be your influence on policy, or that you've got 1,000 members of the public through the doors to look at your research project. So.
If I could add, this issue of incentivization is really key. We indeed have vehicles by which we can communicate our science in a policy realm. There's an online journal, used to be not online, called Policy Options in Canada. And I've managed to contribute a couple of pieces to Policy Options, but it's not peer reviewed. So someone comes to evaluate my CV, not peer reviewed. Well, we'll shunt that aside from a science perspective. And yet it is one of the more valuable and informative ways of outreach, or however one wishes to put this. And indeed, as Daniel says, there are countries, there are funding councils, and it's not yet happened in Canada, but I can see that it will, where you not only need to articulate in your research proposal how you are going to communicate your work publicly, but you are evaluated on that at the end of the project, at the end of the granting period. I sit on the Evolution and Ecology Grant Selection Committee for NSERC in Ottawa right now, and one of the sections of this CCCV, this Common Canadian CV that many of you might be aware of, is something called Other Contributions, or something of this nature. And last year, I was quite struck by the fact that people, well, I'm probably the eldest one on the committee, and people much younger than me were looking at this section on other contributions and attaching a far greater weight than people, I think, at my stage of career would. And I thought, that's quite interesting. It's perhaps a generational shift that might then manifest itself more formally in the granting evaluation process and the granting review process, insofar as there seems to be a greater recognition amongst younger people than others in the utility, if not necessity, of these kinds of communications.
If I could just jump in, I would just add to what Jeffrey said. I think, having used to work for NSERC, I think SSHRC is actually ahead of NSERC in terms of pushing for innovative, novel forms of knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation, in terms of the kinds of research it funds, perhaps not surprisingly. And Canadian Institutes of Health Research is as well. I don't think you can get funding from CIHR unless you have a pretty aggressive knowledge translation section of your grant application. I think NSERC is still a little bit behind, but it's glad to hear that that's starting to catch up. And certainly the open access publishing push by the federal government and open government push, I think it will help as well. But I think more needs to be done. I think more rewards need to be given for, and there needs to be greater incentives and recognition within the academy for the time that it takes and the effort that scientists and researchers have to make to truly effectively participate in science policy type discussions, because they chew up a huge amount of time, as was pointed out in the time constraint aspect of one of the papers we read as backgrounder here.
Got another question?
So my question follows on directly from that. Hi, everybody. I'm wondering whether, so we've spoken, and a number of you have spoken and addressed the issue of what the problem from the academic side, potential for bubble producing thought that is not relevant to policy. And Jeffrey's already touched on this idea that there are successfully, certainly in Canada, experiences that we have where government and academia can cooperate. But my question is, do you think, and this is really a question for all of you, I think, and maybe Dan can speak to it from the British perspective, is there an openness from government department point of view to collaborating with academia enough? And I think this probably depends on departments. DFO has its own traditions in that regard, and some departments are notorious for not. But I just wonder whether or not you think going forward, whether or not academia is, whether the signs are that academia is going to play a more welcomed role by our government at both federal and provincial levels as a source of information, which is part of the decision-making process.
We talked earlier about chief scientific advisors. You can take it potentially as quite telling that we recently in the UK reorganised our departments and came up with some new departments which were needed, such as the Department for Exiting the European Union and the Department for, it's known as DEXU, and a Department for International Trade to try and deal with all the stuff we're going to have to do because we've left the European Union. These departments both initially refused to say whether they were going to have chief scientific advisors. It took a lot of campaigning from scientists, from publications, including the one I work for now, and Nature, where I worked previously, of saying it's essential that these departments have CSAs. There are so many scientific components to what they're going to be doing about standardisation in international trade, or about environmental standards when we leave the European Union. So there was resistance in government, whether that's departmental or ministerial, it's not entirely clear, but those departments didn't want to have CSAs, and they have been forced to have them. That in some ways to me is quite telling. I'd like to think that governments will say science is brilliant, we need more of it, we should get more evidence in from multiple sources, not just from scientists, but from social science, from native people, from economics. I haven't seen any evidence that there's a trend in that direction. I mean, it might be a trend that can be forced, but I don't see it out there in the ether.
Just to kind of go down the line, I can remember a time what was actually the result of a federal government science and technology strategy in the mid-1990s, when all government departments had to have a science and technology advisory committee. So I worked at Environment Canada at the time. We had a departmental science and technology advisory committee. It was actually multi-stakeholder, And going back to Laura's question, I mean, one of the key people on that I remember, because he was quite a character, Peter Calamine, who was a highly respected science journalist in Canada. So he brought a real focus on, you know, effective science communication aspects, which the department really hadn't thought too much about. So there was new efforts made in that kind of area. We actually developed an internal policy on effective science communication, which we had never had before. So I think those can be effective. I remember in the aftermath of the Green Plan, if people remember what the Green Plan was, all departments had to create sustainable development committees and policies on, you know, how they were going to achieve sustainable development. I don't know if that requirement still exists in government. But I was going to go back to one experience I had in the public service. I was at Environment Canada at the time. This would have been at the time that the Chrétien Liberals were in power and Paul Martin was the finance minister. And you remember the Liberal government used to bring out the red books at election time. They had a series of them that came through. So one of the commitments in one of the Liberal red books was to increase a focus on research on toxic substances in the environment. And I can remember that, you know, the initial inclination of the government departments that were going to, you know, implement this election promise was, okay, we're going to sink this money into our base budgets and hire some more scientists and boost up our internal research capacity. And the two ministers said, no, this is going to be, we're going to do something that's going to involve universities as well. We're going to engage academic research in this as well. So figure out a way to collaborate, you know, government scientists with academic scientists and make it about the stuff we need to take action on. So coming back to Jeffrey's point earlier about kind of that policy demand pull, you know, it was at the time when Canada was trying to negotiate effectively on things like transboundary emission of persistent organic pollutants and their effect on northern populations. That, you know, we were finding these chemicals coming from China essentially in northern foods, that you know, traditional foods. So we needed science to try to address those kinds of issues on an international stage. And so, but to come back to the point it was actually politicians that made government and academic scientists work together. That was probably around 1998. And we created a program called the Toxic Substances Research Initiative that did that. It didn't last, but it was a good, interesting experiment.
So I'm afraid we have to end the session. I'm getting all these looks from the from Kevin.
Go over.
So are we going to lose our feed at the wanted? So maybe we can just get some closing comments from Megan and Jeff. And
I'll make my closing comments to the question that Ian asked because I don't know. That's not something I have any expertise in, is understanding if government is interested in partnering with academia, but I do know that government is interested in partnering with multiple stakeholders, and I know that they want some easy wins. If we look at the federal government, which isn't the only government, but if we look at the federal government, they're dealing with pipelines, they're dealing with free trade agreements, they got a lot of unpleasant stuff they're dealing with. They want easy wins. So if academia can play a convening factor or a convening role and bring together different stakeholders where stakeholders can say, hey, we all agree on this thing, guaranteed government is going to act. Someone mentioned the microbeads proposal, which was a motion that I introduced in the House, and the science had been around for quite a while that these were toxic to the environment. The environmental NGOs have been saying for a long time, we want to get rid of this. People have been signing petitions, so there was a little bit of, you know, sort of citizen support on it. But the reason it passed unanimously was because the industry association endorsed the motion. Because they said, you know what, it's time for us to get rid of these plastic microbeads in our products. Some of our members are already doing this. We need to even the playing field, which is a good industry motto. And because industry was on board, boom, passed, unanimous. Couldn't have happened without them. So if there's any way that academics can play that convening role, it can be very, very powerful for making policy.
And I guess I'll just end by pointing at one example that I should have mentioned earlier and one other sort of challenge. And the example is the province of Nova Scotia asked to people at Dalhousie not too long ago to look at the province's regulatory framework vis-a-vis aquaculture. And that was a 1.5, 2-year process, and I think the process and the ask on the part of the provincial government was really an instructive one. So there are examples, and some of those are at the provincial level. I think sometimes we need to look a little more outside of our borders and compare what other countries are doing. We talked a little bit about Chief Science Advisor frameworks. Sir Peter Gluckman, the Chief Science Advisor for New Zealand, one of the signatory or authors of one of the papers, is very well spoken, very worth reading anything he says or writes about. The UK experience is, I think, one that we can absolutely learn from. And from a fisheries perspective, I talked about the fact that science only plays a role in determining limit reference points, but not so much the setting of quotas, not the setting of targets, not these harvest control rules. In the US, all of these are science determined. In the European Union, they are science determined. And indeed, for harvest control rules, if the scientists, it's called the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, each EU country contributes money since 1904 to this body. If the scientists determine that a harvest control rule or the plan is not consistent with the precautionary approach that the ministers come up with, then the scientists will publish one that they think is. Why don't we have that in Canada? If the US can do this, and the EU can do this, why can't we? So when thinking about these challenges that we have, it's important that we look outside and do a comparative analysis, I think.
So I just want to say thank you to our distinguished guest here for discussing what I think the challenges of evidence-based decision-making and providing some tangible ways in which we can address evidence-based, those challenges in decision-making. And I also want to say thanks as well to our audience for being here and asking these extremely relevant questions. And there might be some opportunity to have some one-on-one conversation after, but I know I apologize for a tight time frame. But thank you again for being here.